the first time Aelira Pavik heard the word unlucky. It came from a man in a fur-trimmed coat who looked at her green hands and shook his head like he was refusing a lame horse. She stood in the center of the hiring fair with autumn wind pulling at her threadbare shawl, watching families and single workers stream past the wooden stalls where landowners and stewards sat with ledgers and coin purses. The square smelled of roasting chestnuts and wet leaves, and everywhere around her people were shaking hands, agreeing on wages, starting the negotiations that would carry them through winter. She had been standing there since dawn, moving from stall to stall with her shoulders straight and her small tusks carefully hidden behind pressed lips, and every single one had turned her away. "I can work," she said to the man in the fur coat, who represented a grain merchant 2 valleys over. "I am strong, I learn quickly, I will not complain." "You are an orc," he said, not unkindly but with the flat certainty of someone stating that the sky was blue. "And you are in mourning. Look at you. I can see it in your eyes. Grief makes workers slow, makes them careless. Bad luck to have someone mourning on your land. Crops fail. Animals sicken. Everyone knows it." Aelira felt the words settle into her chest like stones. She wanted to argue, to tell him that her husband had been dead for 4 months now, and she had not stopped moving since, had not allowed herself the luxury of slowness, had worked their small plot alone until the landlord took it back because a widow could not pay the rent. She wanted to say that her daughter needed to eat, that grief did not make her unlucky, only desperate. But the man was already waving her away, already looking past her to a young human boy with eager eyes and no shadows clinging to his shoulders. She moved to the next stall and the next, and heard variations of the same refusal. "Too risky. Too sad. We need workers with clear heads and strong backs, not someone who will weep into the furrows." One woman actually made a warning gesture when Aelira approached, as if sorrow were contagious, as if death might leap from green skin to pale and drag them all down together. By midday, Aelira was considering whether she could make it to the next town before dark, whether there might be work there, whether she should simply take Greta and walk until they found some place that did not care about the color of her skin or the weight in her heart. Her daughter was waiting at the boarding house, 7 years old and too thin, and Aelira had promised her they would have work by nightfall, that everything would be all right. She did not know how to go back and say she had failed. "Excuse me," a voice said behind her, warm and slightly amused. "Did I hear correctly that you are looking for work?" Aelira turned and found herself looking at a human man in his early 30s, tall and lean with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and eyes the color of amber in sunlight. He wore good clothes, well made but not showy, and he was smiling at her with the kind of easy charm that seemed entirely effortless. For a moment she thought he was mocking her, that this was some new cruelty, but then she saw the way the smile did not quite reach his eyes, the way his hands were shoved into his pockets as if holding himself together. "I am," she said carefully. "I can do most things. Field work, animal care, kitchen duties if needed." "Can you work a vineyard?" he asked. "Pruning, training the vines, harvest work when the time comes." "I have not done it before," Aelira said, forcing herself to meet his eyes, "but I can learn. I am good with growing things." "That is all I need," the man said. He held out his hand. "Vaughn Calloway. I own a vineyard about 3 miles west of here. Small operation, maybe 4 acres of vines and a house that needs more work than I have time to give it. My last workers left at the end of harvest, and I need someone to help me get through the winter pruning." Aelira stared at his outstretched hand. "You heard what they said, about grief making me unlucky." "I did," Vaughn said. His smile faded slightly, and something raw and honest flickered across his face. "I also think it is complete horseshit. Pardon my language, but I buried my wife 3 months ago and I have not suddenly become cursed or useless, and I do not imagine you have either. Grief is just grief. It does not make the vines grow crooked or the wine turn sour. It just makes everything harder for a while." The words hit Aelira like a hand reaching through dark water. She had not expected understanding, had not thought anyone in this town would look at her and see something other than a liability. She took his hand slowly, felt the firm grip, and the calluses that spoke of real work, not a gentleman farmer playing at labor. "I have a daughter," she said. 7 years old. If I take this position, she comes with me. I will not leave her behind. Bring her," Vaughn said immediately. "The house has extra rooms. She can help in the garden if she wants or just be a child. I do not mind either way. Wages are 2 silver a week plus room and board for both of you. I can pay a month in advance if that helps." It was more than fair. It was generous, actually, and Aelira felt a flicker of suspicion because generosity in her experience often came with hidden costs. But Vaughn was already pulling a small purse from his belt, counting out coins with brisk efficiency, and when he handed them over his fingers did not linger, his eyes did not travel anywhere they should not. He simply looked tired and sad, and like he was trying very hard to keep moving forward. "When can you start?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning," Aelira said. She clutched the coins tightly, feeling the cool weight of them, the sudden possibility of safety. "We will be ready." "Good," Vaughn said. "I will send a cart for you at dawn. Where are you staying?" She gave him the name of the boarding house, and he nodded, then tipped his head in a small bow that was surprisingly courteous. "I will see you tomorrow, then. And Aelira," he paused, his expression softening. "Thank you. I know you do not know me yet, but I think this will be good for both of us." Then he was gone, striding back through the crowd with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders just a little too rigid. And Aelira stood in the middle of the hiring fair with silver in her palm and hope sitting uncertainly in her chest. The vineyard was more beautiful than Aelira had expected, and more melancholy. It sat in a gentle valley with the vines marching in neat rows down the hillside, their leaves turned gold and crimson with the season. The house was 2 stories of weathered stone with a red tile roof and windows that caught the morning light, and behind it stood a small barn, a cellar built into the hillside, and a garden that had clearly been loved once but was now overgrown with weeds. Everything about the place spoke of care and attention slowly fraying at the edges, of one person trying to do the work of 2, and not quite managing. Vaughn met them at the gate with a wheelbarrow full of pruning tools and a smile that looked a little more genuine in the daylight. He greeted Greta with the same easy courtesy he had shown Aelira, crouching down to her level and asking if she liked grapes. Greta, who had been silent and wary all morning, nodded slowly, and Vaughn grinned. "Good," he said. "Because we have about 1,000 vines that need attention, and I could use someone to help me keep count. Do you know your numbers?" "Up to 20, Greta said, her voice small but steady. "Perfect," Vaughn said. "That is exactly what I need." He stood and gestured toward the house. "Aelira, let me show you the rooms first, then we can start on the vines. No sense working until you have had a chance to settle in." The house was warm inside, with thick rugs on the floors and furniture that was simple but well made. Vaughn led them upstairs to 2 adjoining rooms that looked out over the vineyard, both clean and plainly furnished. There were quilts on the beds and a small vase of dried flowers on the windowsill, and Aelira realized with a pang that he had prepared for them, had made sure the rooms were welcoming. "The kitchen is downstairs," Vaughn said. "Help yourself to anything." "I am not much of a cook, but there is bread and cheese and some preserves that my neighbor brought over. We can work out meals as we go, but I do not expect you to do all the cooking on top of the field work. We will share the load." Aelira set down the small bundle that held everything she and Greta owned in the world. "This is very generous," she said quietly. "I did not expect such accommodations." Vaughn shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the praise. "It is just a room," he said. "I have more space than I know what to do with these days. Anyway, take your time getting settled. I will be in the east field when you are ready." He left them there, and Aelira sat on the edge of the bed and felt something in her chest loosen slightly. Greta climbed up beside her, tucking herself against her mother's side, and for a moment they just sat together in the quiet room with sunlight streaming through the window. "I like him," Greta whispered. "He seems kind." "He does," Aelira agreed. She wrapped an arm around her daughter and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "We will be all right here, little one. I think we will be all right." The work began that afternoon, and Aelira learned quickly that Vaughn had not been exaggerating about the vineyard's needs. The vines were overgrown and tangled, some of them clearly neglected for more than one season, and the pruning work was meticulous and demanding. Vaughn showed her how to identify the canes that needed to come off, how to cut at the right angle to encourage new growth, how to train the remaining shoots along the wire trellises. He was patient and thorough, demonstrating each technique multiple times until she felt confident, and he worked alongside her with steady focus. They did not talk much that first day, just moved down the rows in comfortable silence, the snip of shears and the rustle of leaves filling the air. Greta wandered between them, collecting the cut canes into piles and occasionally asking questions that Vaughn answered with genuine interest. By the time the sun began to set, Aelira's hands were scratched and her back ached, but it was the good ache of useful labor, of work that mattered. That night they ate together at the kitchen table, a simple meal of bread and stew that Vaughn had made with surprising competence. Greta fell asleep halfway through, her head nodding forward, and Vaughn smiled gently. "Long day for her," he said. "You can put her to bed. I will clean up." Aelira carried her daughter upstairs, tucked her into the narrow bed, and stood for a moment watching her sleep. Then she went back downstairs and found Vaughn washing dishes in the basin, his sleeves rolled up and his expression distant. She picked up a cloth and started drying, and they worked in silence for a while. "Your wife," Aelira said finally, carefully. "What was her name?" "Elaine," Vaughn said. He did not look up from the dish he was scrubbing. "She was a painter, very talented. She used to set up her easel in the vineyard and paint the vines at different times of day. I still find sketches tucked into drawers sometimes, little studies of leaves and grapes." "My husband was called Torek," Aelira said. The name felt heavy in her mouth, something she had not spoken aloud in weeks. "He was a mason, very strong, very steady. He always said he could build anything, make any stone stand firm. Then he fell from a scaffold and broke his neck, and there was nothing I could do but watch him die." Vaughn's hands stilled in the water. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I am sorry for you as well," Aelira said. "What happened to Elaine?" "Fever," Vaughn said. "It came on fast. One day she was fine, laughing at something, painting by the window. 3 days later she was gone. I keep thinking I should have noticed sooner, should have brought the healer faster. Maybe if I had not been so focused on the harvest." He stopped himself, shook his head. "But that is the thing about grief, is it not? All the should-haves and what-ifs, they do not change anything. They just make it harder to breathe." Aelira nodded slowly. She knew exactly what he meant, had spent months suffocating under the weight of her own regrets. "The hiring fair steward said grief makes people slow," she said, "but I think it is the opposite. I think it makes you move too fast, because if you stop you will fall apart." "Yes," Vaughn said. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Exactly that." They stood there in the kitchen with dishes dripping and the fire burning low in the hearth, and something unspoken passed between them. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition. The understanding that they were both walking the same razor edge between functioning and falling, and that maybe, just maybe, they did not have to walk it alone. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost like healing. They worked the vineyard together, moving through the rows with quiet efficiency, and Vaughn taught Aelira everything he knew about the vines. She learned to read the plants, to see the subtle signs of disease or stress, to understand the way the grapes responded to sun and rain, and the careful attention of human hands. It was meditative work, and she found herself falling into a kind of peace while she pruned and tied and tended. Vaughn was good company, thoughtful and attentive without being overbearing. He had a wry sense of humor that surfaced at unexpected moments, making dry observations about the stubbornness of plants or the questionable wisdom of their neighbors. He asked about Greta's education, and started teaching her letters in the evenings, pulling out old books from Elaine's collection, and reading to her with patient care. He made sure Aelira took breaks, brought her water on warm days, noticed when she was favoring her left hand and showed her how to wrap it to ease the strain. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk about the people they had lost. It started with small things. Vaughn mentioned that Elaine had always sung while she worked, silly tavern songs that made him laugh. Aelira said that Torek had been terrible at cooking, that he once burned water somehow, and she still did not understand how he managed it. They traded stories like fragile gifts, testing the weight of each memory, learning the shape of each other's grief. Aelira learned that Elaine had wanted children, but they had agreed to wait until the vineyard was more established, and now Vaughn carried the guilt of that waiting like a stone. She told him about the night Torek died, how she had held his hand and felt the life slip out of him, how Greta had been sleeping in the next room and woke to find her father gone. They spoke about the loneliness of widowhood, the way people looked at you differently, the awkward condolences that felt more like accusations. "My family said I should not have come here," Aelira said one afternoon as they worked side by side in the winter cold. "They said it was unseemly to live in a human man's house while I am still in mourning, that I should have stayed with my clan, worn black for a full year, kept myself apart." Vaughn snorted. "My neighbors said much the same. That I am disrespecting Elaine's memory by hiring you, that I should have found a human worker, that people will talk." "Are they talking?" Aelira asked. "Probably," Vaughn said. He did not sound particularly concerned, but they were talking anyway. Grief makes people uncomfortable. They want you to mourn in a way that does not inconvenience them, that stays neat and contained and ends on a schedule they approve of. To hell with that. Aelira smiled despite herself. "I think you and I are both terrible at grieving properly." "The worst," Vaughn agreed. "Absolute disasters. We should probably be ashamed of ourselves." But he said it with a grin, and Aelira laughed, and it felt like a small rebellion against the weight of expectation. As winter deepened, they worked on restoring the parts of the vineyard that everyone had said were lost. There was a section on the north slope where the vines had been neglected for years, twisted and overgrown and thick with dead wood. The previous workers had written it off as unsalvageable, but Vaughn wanted to try, and Aelira found herself caught up in the challenge of it. They spent days cutting back the tangle, revealing the old trunks underneath, coaxing new growth from wood that looked lifeless. It was hard work, sometimes frustrating, but there was something deeply satisfying about bringing life back to something people had given up on. Aelira could not help but see the metaphor in it, the way they were both trying to grow new shoots from old grief, and she thought Vaughn saw it too from the way he looked at the vines with quiet determination. Greta thrived in the vineyard. She lost the pinched, anxious look she had worn since her father's death, and started running through the rows with a child's easy joy. Vaughn was endlessly patient with her, letting her help with small tasks and praising her efforts with genuine warmth. Aelira watched them together and felt something complicated twist in her chest, a mix of gratitude and fear and the first tentative stirrings of something she was not ready to name. She knew she was drawn to Vaughn, knew that his kindness and his humor and the way he looked at her like she was capable and strong all appealed to her in ways that felt both wonderful and terrifying. But she also knew it was too soon, that Torek had only been gone 6 months, that she should not be thinking about another man when her husband's grave was still fresh. The guilt sat heavy on her shoulders, warring with the equally strong pull toward Vaughn, toward the possibility of something new. If Vaughn felt the same, he did not say. He was careful with her, respectful, never crossing the invisible lines they had drawn around themselves. But sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression that was soft and wondering. And sometimes when they worked close together his hand would brush hers and linger just a moment longer than necessary. It was a slow dance, both of them circling something neither was quite ready to acknowledge. In early spring, everything changed. Vaughn's late wife's family arrived unannounced on a cold morning, 3 of them riding up the lane in a carriage with the family crest painted on the door. Aelira was in the garden when they came, planting early vegetables, and she heard the raised voices from the house and felt her stomach clench with instinct alarm. She found Vaughn standing in the yard with his arms crossed, facing a tall man with graying hair and a woman in expensive mourning clothes. Another man, younger and harder looking, stood slightly behind them. All 3 were glaring at Vaughn with open hostility. "You cannot be serious," the older man was saying. "You expect us to believe you are managing this estate properly when you are clearly still in the depths of grief. Look at this place. It is falling apart." "The vineyard is doing fine," Vaughn said tightly. "Better than fine, actually. We have been working the neglected sections and everything is on track for a good vintage this year." The woman's eyes flicked to Aelira and her expression curdled. "You mean the orc? Vaughn, this is disgraceful. You have brought a greenskin into my daughter's home. Let her sleep under this roof while Elaine is barely cold in the ground. Have you no shame?" Aelira felt the words like a slap, but she kept her expression neutral and her hands steady. She had dealt with worse than a grieving mother's contempt. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "Aelira is my employee," Vaughn said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She has every right to be here, and she has been invaluable in maintaining the vineyard. What she is not is any of your business." "She is very much our business," the older man said, "because we are contesting your stewardship of this estate. Elaine left no will, which means her property reverts to her family, and we are not about to let you run it into the ground while you wallow in grief and make poor decisions." Vaughn went very still. "You are trying to take the vineyard. We are trying to protect our daughter's legacy," the woman said. "You are clearly not in a fit state to manage it. You have dismissed your workers, hired an orc in their place, and by all accounts you spend your days brooding in the fields. The courts will see reason. A grieving man cannot be trusted to maintain an estate, especially not when he is making such obviously questionable choices." "Get out," Vaughn said, his voice shaking with fury. "Get off my land, now." The younger man stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of a sword. You should watch your tone. We are family. You are vultures, Vaughn snapped. You never cared about Elaine when she was alive, never visited, never wrote. But now that she is gone, you want to swoop in and claim what is hers. No, this vineyard was our dream, mine and hers, and I will die before I let you take it. The older man smiled coldly. We shall see what the magistrate says. You have until the end of summer to prove the estate is thriving under your stewardship. If you cannot, the courts will assign it to us. Consider this your notice. They left in a swirl of dust and hostility, and Vaughn stood in the yard with his fists clenched and his breathing ragged. Aelira approached carefully, unsure what to say, and when he looked at her, his eyes were wild with panic. They are going to take it, he said. Everything Elaine and I built. They are going to take it because I am grieving, and everyone thinks that makes me incompetent. Then we prove them wrong, Aelira said firmly. You said the vines are doing well. We make sure they do better. We produce the best vintage this valley has ever seen, and we show the magistrate that you are more than capable of running this place. Vaughn stared at her. You would help me fight them. Even though they will use you as ammunition, say I am unfit because I hired an orc. Especially then, Aelira said. Because if they win, I lose this place too, and Greta loses her home. So yes, I will help you fight. We will do it together. Vaughn's expression crumbled, and for a moment she thought he might weep. But he pulled himself together, nodded once, and reached out to grip her hand tightly. Thank you, he said. I do not know what I did to deserve your loyalty, but thank you. Aelira squeezed his hand back. You gave me a chance when no one else would, she said. You treated me like a person, not a problem. That is worth fighting for. The spring and summer that followed were a blur of relentless work. They threw themselves into the vineyard with renewed determination, tending every vine with meticulous care, monitoring the developing grapes for any sign of disease or stress. Vaughn kept detailed records of everything they did, documenting the progress of the neglected sections, noting the health of the plants and the quality of the fruit. Aelira worked from dawn to dusk, and she learned more about viticulture in those months than she had ever imagined possible. The neighbors watched with barely concealed curiosity, and some of them were not subtle about their disapproval. Aelira overheard muttered comments in the village when she went to buy supplies, whispers about the impropriety of a widower and a widow working so closely together, speculation about what might be happening in the big house at night. She ignored it as best she could, but it stung, especially when some of the gossip reached Greta's ears and the girl came home asking anxious questions about whether they were doing something wrong. We are not doing anything wrong, Aelira told her daughter firmly. We are working hard and taking care of ourselves. Do not listen to people who have nothing better to do than judge others. But the weight of it pressed on her, and she knew it pressed on Vaughn too. He grew quieter as the summer wore on, more withdrawn, and she could see the strain in the tightness of his jaw and the shadows under his eyes. He was terrified of losing the vineyard, of failing Elaine's memory, and the fear was eating him alive. One evening in late summer, as they finished the day's work and stood looking out over the rows of heavy-laden vines, Vaughn finally broke. I do not know if I can do this, he said quietly. What if the vintage is not good enough? What if the magistrate sides with them anyway, because they are human and wealthy, and I am just a grieving fool with an orc worker? Aelira turned to face him. You are not a fool, she said. You are one of the strongest people I have ever met. You took a chance on me when everyone else saw a liability. You have worked yourself to exhaustion to save this place. You honor Elaine every single day by refusing to give up on the dream you shared. That is not foolishness. That is courage. Vaughn looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. "You see me more clearly than I see myself," he said softly. "I do not know how you do it, but you make me believe I can survive this, that I can be more than just my grief." "You do the same for me," Aelira said. Her heart was pounding, and she knew they were standing on the edge of something dangerous and wonderful. "When I first came here, I thought I was just broken, that I would carry Torik's death like a weight forever and never be anything more than a widow who could not move on. But you showed me that grief does not have to be the only thing I am, that I can mourn and still live, still hope." Vaughn reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her pointed ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, and Aelira felt herself lean into the touch despite every instinct that said it was too soon, too complicated, too risky. "I think I am falling in love with you," Vaughn said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I do not know if that is all right, or if I am betraying Elaine, or if you even want this. But I need you to know. You have become everything to me. This vineyard, this life, none of it means anything if you are not in it." Aelira felt tears prick her eyes. "I think I am falling in love with you too," she said. "And I am terrified because I loved Torik so much and losing him almost destroyed me. I do not know if I am strong enough to risk that kind of pain again. But when I am with you, I feel like maybe I could be. Maybe we both could." Vaughn pulled her into his arms then, and Aelira went willingly, pressing her face against his shoulder and feeling the solid warmth of him. They stood there in the fading light, holding each other like lifelines, and it felt like the first honest thing either of them had done in months. "We do not have to decide anything right now," Vaughn murmured into her hair. "We can take this slowly, figure it out as we go, but I want you to know that you are not alone. Whatever happens with the estate, with the magistrate, with all of it, we face it together." "Together," Aelira agreed. She pulled back just enough to look up at him, and when he bent his head to kiss her, she met him halfway, letting herself fall into the sweetness of it, the gentle press of lips and the promise of something new growing in the ruins of old grief. The harvest came in late summer, and it was everything they had hoped for. The grapes were fat and sweet, bursting with juice, and even the neglected section on the north slope produced a respectable yield. They picked for days, filling basket after basket, and Vaughn walked the rows with an expression of cautious hope that made Aelira's chest tight. "It is good," he said, tasting one of the grapes and closing his eyes. "It is really good. This might be the best vintage I have ever produced." They pressed the grapes and transferred the juice to barrels in the cellar, and then came the waiting. The fermentation took weeks, and every day Vaughn checked the barrels, monitoring the progress with the focused intensity of a man whose entire future hung in the balance. Elaine's family returned in early autumn with the magistrate in tow, a stern older man who listened to their accusations with a neutral expression. They claimed Vaughn was incompetent, that the vineyard was suffering under his management, that he had made reckless decisions driven by grief rather than reason. They produced witnesses who testified to his withdrawn behavior, his decision to fire the previous workers, his choice to hire an orc widow instead of experienced humans. Vaughn stood before them all in the cellar, surrounded by barrels of fermenting wine, and made his case with quiet dignity. He presented the detailed records he had kept, showing the work they had done, the improvements to the neglected sections, the health of the vines. He invited the magistrate to inspect the property, to see for himself that everything was thriving. And then he opened one of the barrels and poured samples of the new wine. The magistrate tasted it slowly, thoughtfully, and his expression shifted from neutrality to surprise. He took another sip, then another, and finally he looked at Vaughn with something like respect. "This is excellent," he said. "Truly excellent. I have tasted wines from the best vineyards in the region, and this rivals them. You have done remarkable work here." Elaine's family protested, insisted that one good vintage was not enough to prove competence, that Vaughn was still clearly unstable. But the magistrate cut them off with a sharp gesture. "I see no evidence of instability," he said. "I see a man who has worked diligently to maintain his estate despite personal tragedy. I see detailed records, healthy vines, and a wine that speaks for itself. As for his choice of workers, that is his business, not yours. Miss Pavik has clearly been an asset to this operation, and the suggestion that her presence somehow disqualifies him is both prejudiced and irrelevant." He turned to Vaughn. "The estate remains under your stewardship. I see no reason to transfer ownership." Elaine's family left in furious silence, and Vaughn stood in the cellar with his hands shaking and tears streaming down his face. Aelira went to him immediately, and he pulled her into a crushing embrace, burying his face in her shoulder. "We did it," he whispered. "We actually did it." "We did," Aelira said. She was crying too, relief and joy and exhaustion all tangled together. "The vineyard is yours, ours. We saved it." They held each other for a long time, and when they finally pulled apart, Vaughn cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with a fierceness that stole her breath. "I could not have done this without you," he said. "You saved me, Aelira, in every way that matters." "You saved me too," Aelira said. She pressed her forehead to his, feeling the warmth of his breath against her lips. "We saved each other." The first bottling happened on a crisp autumn morning, the air smelling of wood smoke and ripening apples. Vaughn and Aelira worked side by side in the cellar, transferring the wine from barrels to bottles with steady, practiced movements. Greta sat on a stool nearby, carefully writing labels in her neat child's handwriting, and the cellar was filled with quiet contentment. When the last bottle was filled and corked, Vaughn pulled 2 glasses from the shelf and poured for himself and Aelira. They stood in the cool dimness of the cellar, holding the glasses up to the light filtering through the high windows, watching the wine glow ruby red. "To Elaine," Vaughn said softly, "who taught me to love this place and dream big. To Torek," Aelira added, "who taught me that strength comes in many forms." They drank, the wine smooth and complex on their tongues, and it tasted like victory and remembrance and the bittersweetness of moving forward. They stood in silence for a moment, honoring the dead, acknowledging the grief that would always be part of them. And then Vaughn set down his glass and took Aelira's hand, lacing their fingers together. "To us," he said, his voice stronger now. "To new beginnings and shared burdens and whatever comes next." Aelira squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that matched her own, the strength and steadiness that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. "To us," she agreed. They walked out of the cellar together, into the bright autumn sunlight, and Greta ran to meet them with a handful of wildflowers she had picked from the garden. She gave them to Aelira with a shy smile, and Aelira tucked them into her hair, feeling something in her chest settle into place. That evening, as the 3 of them sat around the kitchen table sharing a simple meal, Vaughn reached across and took Aelira's hand again. Greta looked up from her plate, her eyes curious, and Vaughn smiled at her. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "that maybe we should make this official. Not rush into anything, but start planning for a future together, if that is something you both want." Greta's face lit up. "Would we stay here forever?" she asked. "Would this be our home?" "If your mother agrees," Vaughn said, looking at Aelira with quiet hope. "I would like nothing more than to have you both as permanent parts of my life, not just workers, but family." Aelira felt tears welling up, but they were good tears, the kind that came from happiness rather than grief. "I would like that very much," she said. "I think we all would." Vaughn grinned. sudden and bright, and pulled them both into a hug across the table. Greta giggled and Aelira laughed, and for the first time in a very long time she felt the future stretching out before her like a gift rather than a burden. They married in the spring, a simple ceremony in the vineyard with a handful of friends and neighbors who had come to accept the unlikely partnership. Aelira wore a dress the color of wine, and Vaughn wore his best coat, and they spoke their vows standing between the rows of vines that had brought them together. Greta stood beside them with a crown of flowers in her hair, beaming with joy. The years that followed were not always easy. There were hard winters and difficult harvests, years when the rain came too late or the frost came too early. There were people who never stopped disapproving, neighbors who muttered about mixed marriages and the impropriety of it all. But Vaughn and Aelira faced it together, supporting each other through every challenge, building a life that honored both their pasts and their present. The vineyard thrived under their joint stewardship, producing vintages that gained a reputation throughout the region. People came from miles away to taste the wine made by the grieving widower and the orc woman who had saved each other. And if some of them came out of curiosity about the scandalous nature of their partnership, they stayed because the wine was undeniably excellent. Greta grew up strong and confident, learning the vineyard business from the ground up, and eventually they hired more workers to help manage the expanding operation. Aelira taught them what Vaughn had taught her, passing on the knowledge with the same patience he had shown. She became known in the valley as a skilled viticulturist, and the whispers about her being unlucky faded into memory. On quiet evenings, Vaughn and Aelira would walk through the rows together, checking the vines and enjoying the peace of the land they had built together. They would talk about their days, make plans for the next season, share small moments of contentment. And sometimes, when the light was right and the air was still, they would pause and remember the people they had lost, acknowledging that grief never fully disappeared but became something that could coexist with joy. You think they would approve? Aelira asked one evening as they stood at the top of the north slope, looking down over the vineyard bathed in golden sunset light. Elaine and Toric, do you think they would be happy for us? Vaughn was quiet for a moment, considering. I think Elaine would have liked you, he said finally. She always said I needed someone who could match my stubbornness, who would not let me wallow when things got hard. And Toric sounds like the kind of man who would have wanted you to be happy, to build a new life rather than just surviving in the ruins of the old one. I think so too, Aelira said. She leaned against Vaughn's shoulder, feeling his arm come around her waist. I think they would understand that loving again does not mean we loved them less, that making room for new joy does not erase old grief. Exactly, Vaughn said. He pressed a kiss to her temple. We carry them with us, always, but we keep moving forward, together. Aelira smiled and turned in his arms, rising on her toes to kiss him properly. The vineyard stretched out around them, row after row of healthy vines heavy with the promise of another good harvest, and overhead the sky was turning pink and gold with the setting sun. In the distance, she could hear Greta laughing at something, her voice bright and carefree. This was home. This was family. This was the life she had never imagined she could have again, born from grief and tended with care until it grew into something beautiful and strong. She had been told that sorrow made her unlucky, that no one would want a mourning woman, that grief was something to hide and overcome alone. But Vaughn had looked at her grief and recognized his own, had hired her not despite her sorrow but because he understood it, had grieved beside her until they both learned that loss shared became bearable and eventually, impossibly, transformed into hope. She thought of that hiring fare, of standing alone in the cold while everyone turned her away, and she marveled at how a single moment of understanding could change everything. How one man's willingness to see past prejudice and convention had given her not just work but purpose, not just shelter but love, not just survival but a future worth building. "Thank you," she said to Vaughn, the words inadequate but heartfelt, "for taking a chance on me, for seeing me when everyone else looked away." Vaughn smiled, warm and gentle and full of love. "Thank you for staying," he said, "for fighting for this place with me, for teaching me that I could grieve and love at the same time, that one does not cancel out the other." They stood together on their land as the sun dipped below the horizon, and Aelira felt peace settle into her bones. The past would always be part of her, Toric's memory woven into the fabric of who she was, but she was no longer defined solely by loss. She was a wife again, a mother, a partner in a thriving business, a woman who had found her way through darkness into light. The vines rustled in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the house Greta was calling them to dinner, and Vaughn took her hand to walk back down the slope together. Aelira went with him gladly, her heart full, ready to face whatever came next with the man who had hired her when no one else would, who had grieved beside her until grief became something they could carry together, lighter for being shared. And in the cellar, row upon row of bottles waited, each one a testament to what could be built from sorrow, each vintage a reminder that even the vines everyone said were dead could bloom again with the right care, the right partnership, the right hope. They had saved the vineyard together. But more importantly, they had saved each other, and that was worth more than any vintage, any estate, any approval from a world that had tried to tell them grief made them less. They had proven that mourning and living could exist side by side, that love could grow even in the shadow of loss, that two broken people could build something whole and beautiful and lasting. As they reached the house and stepped inside to warmth and laughter and the simple comfort of family, Aelira looked back once at the vineyard stretching into the twilight. The rows of vines stood silent and strong, and she smiled, knowing that tomorrow they would wake and tend them again, that this work, this life, this love would continue growing season after season, rooted deep and reaching toward the sun.